G'day. So the question today is, how am I meant to apply a law from the Old Testament to my life today as a Christian? And yes, I'm sitting in my car because it's a rainy day, 5 kids, 3 cats. There's just no space to record without noise in my house. So I'm sitting in the car on the side of the road. Anyway, the question is, I'm not going to tell you everything about the Old Testament law today. I'm just trying to answer the one question: what am I as a Christian meant to be doing with the Old Testament laws? So here we go.
For example, Leviticus 19:19 contains 3 laws. Do not mate different kinds of animals. Do not plant your fields with 2 kinds of seed. Do not wear clothing woven of 2 kinds of material. As a Christian following Jesus, what am I meant to do with these laws?
I'm going to suggest that it's just not as simple as ignore these laws completely, nor as simple as keep them all to the letter. And my reason for saying that is because for the New Testament, it doesn't model either of those approaches to the Old Testament law. And as Christians, we want to look to the New Testament to see how we should respond to the Old Testament laws. And when we do that, we work out that there's basically 3 stages that we need to go through to rightly understand each Old Testament law.
First, you've got to have in mind the big picture framework. Now, the Bible is one big story, starting from creation and going all the way through to the promised new creation. God's original plans for his creation are disrupted by human sin. And so, as part of his story of salvation, at the centre is what Jesus does for us as God's Christ, God's Messiah, in his death and resurrection. And the way God takes his creation through Jesus to new creation is through a series of covenants. A covenant is a binding agreement, in this case, unilaterally established by God with those whom he graciously chooses. God establishes key covenants with Abram, with Moses and the Israelites at Mount Sinai, with King David, and then promises a new covenant through the prophets. And that new covenant, according to Jesus, was established in Jesus' own death. So these earlier covenants with Abraham, Moses and David, they don't so much replace each other but build on each other, and each of them find their fulfillment in the new covenant established then in Jesus. So as you read through the Old Testament, there is this narrowing of focus from all of creation through the choosing of Abraham and his descendants, then the choosing of Israel as God's people, and to the choosing of a righteous remnant within Israel of those who truly loved God with all their heart and mind and strength, and their neighbour as themselves. In fact, that narrowing continues all the way down until Jesus arrives on the scene. At the very point of his death, he alone is the righteous Israelite. Everyone else, we know, has deserted him. But as a result of Jesus' death and resurrection, salvation and new life is opened up to everyone, not just those from national Israel. Jesus' followers are to make disciples from every nation, and the New Testament finishes with a vision of countless multitudes from every nation and language gathered around God's throne, praising Jesus and praising the one true living God. Well, that's the big picture of the Bible story. How does the Old Testament law fit into this picture? Well, the Old Testament law was given by God as part of the covenant established with Moses and the Israelites at Mount Sinai when God brought them out of slavery in Egypt. Keeping that law was how the Old Testament Israelites expressed their love for God and their love for neighbour. It marked them out as his holy chosen people. But what are we as Christians meant to do with it?
So what are we as Christians meant to do with the Old Testament law? I think the New Testament gives us 3 important truths to remember here. I've been greatly helped in my own thinking by Brian Rosner and his book Paul and the Law, but my 3 points are a little bit different to his.
First of all, as an entire code of laws, the Old Testament law has been repealed by Christ. The New Testament tells us in Romans 10 that Christ is the end of the law, meaning I think both the goal and the full stop that brought the law to an end. So as an entire law code, it's been repealed, set aside. Christians no longer live under the old covenant law. We're free from the strictures of this old code.
Interestingly, even the 10 Commandments as a set of laws no longer straightforwardly apply to us as Christians. For example, The fourth command told the Israelites to remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. And yet in Romans 14:5, writing in light of the new covenant in Christ, Paul can say, one person considers one day more sacred than another, another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. So even the Sabbath law no longer straightforwardly applies under the new covenant. The law had a particular function to play until Jesus and the new covenant arrived. And if you want to chase it down some more, look up Galatians 3 and see how Paul talked about the purpose and function of the law now that Jesus had come.
The second point is that since Christ is the goal of the law, even though it's been repealed, that law is still recognised as prophecy that points to Christ. So Jesus himself pointed out that the Old Testament scriptures spoke about him as the promised Christ. You can look up John 5:39 or Luke 24:44, where Jesus explicitly mentions fulfilling what was written in the law about him. Or notice how the New Testament book of Hebrews repeatedly shows that Jesus is the fulfillment of elements of the Old Testament temple system. He's the ultimate and true sacrifice, he's the high priest, all of which originates in the Old Testament law. So the Old Testament law still has an important place for Christians as prophecy pointing to Christ. But that's not all. And it's the third point about the law that requires the most care. The third point is this: even though as an entirety the law has been repealed in Christ, the law is now reappropriated in Christ as wisdom.
Now this really is the key point. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 16, Paul tells us that the scriptures, by which he means the Old Testament scriptures including the law, are God-breathed and useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting and training in righteousness, so that those belonging to God might be thoroughly equipped for every good work. So God has given us the Old Testament and the Old Testament law to equip us as Christians to live for him. We must not write it off as irrelevant, but work out how it is useful now in training us to live for God under the new covenant in Christ. We do this by reappropriating the law not as a new law code to follow, but as Christian wisdom.
But what does this mean, to reappropriate the law as Christian wisdom? And how do we do that for any particular law? Well, there's two further observations that will help us do this. First, Jesus upholds the heart of the law as continuing under the new covenant that he establishes in his death and resurrection. Namely, all the Old Testament laws can be summarised as love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. That's what Jesus himself says in Matthew chapter 22 verses 34 to 40, and it's reflected in other places like Romans 13, 8 to 10.
This is the consistent heart of God's expectations for his people across the Old and the New Covenant. The heart of his expectation for his people doesn't change. It's to love him and to love your neighbour as yourself. But what does this mean for us when we're reading the Old Testament law? Well, it means that the Old Testament law shows us what it looked like for them under the Old Covenant to love God and to love their neighbour as themselves. So when we as Christians read that Old Testament, it's worth us asking, how does this particular law under the Old Covenant help them express love for God and love for neighbour? It won't look the same for us, but it does tell us what love looked like for them in their situation.
But the second thing to remember is that the law always functioned with creation in the background. Now remember that the law was given to the Israelites within the wider Bible story of what God is doing in the world. He's taking the world from creation to new creation. So in particular, through the law, God was recovering his good creation purposes by establishing a holy people who would live his way in his world.
So the Old Testament laws often reflect that God had ordered his creation in a certain way. And that can help make sense of some of the particular laws that might otherwise seem very arbitrary. For example, let's go back to the 3 laws with which we started from Leviticus 19 verse 19. Those laws were encouraging the Israelites as God's people to reflect the ordering that he had established in his creation. They were to respect the way that he'd made the animals according to their particular kinds and the plants according to their particular kinds by not crossbreeding the animals or planting 2 types of seed in the same field. And more generally, by not wearing clothing woven of 2 types of material, they were respecting the order that God had created in creation. They were expressing a love for God, the ordered creator. Now, as Christians under the New Covenant, we're not under that law code. But you can start to see how they might function for us as wisdom. They show that respecting God's ordering of creation is important to him. It matters to God, and therefore it must matter to us, his people. Respecting his creating ordering is part of how we love him with all our heart, soul, mind and strength. How we then live that out, that respect for his ordering, that's not necessarily prescribed for us. We're free from the Old Testament law code because it's been repealed by Christ. But it does make us wise to understand what matters to God, and in our love for him and neighbour, we're then called to live in light of that wisdom. Now, how we do this? Well, that brings us to the 3rd stage.
So when dealing with any particular Old Testament law, we're left with 3 possibilities. First, it's explicitly upheld under the New Covenant in the New Testament. A good example, don't steal. It's the 8th commandment in Exodus 20, and yet it's reiterated in the New Testament in, say, Ephesians 4:28, when Paul says anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer. Or another example, the 5th commandment from the 10 commandments, honour your father and mother. That's explicitly upheld under the New Covenant in the New Testament instructions to children in, say, Ephesians 6:1-3 or Colossians 3:20. Since these Old Testament laws are explicitly upheld in the New Testament, we know that they rightly express what it means to love God and love neighbour under the New Covenant in Christ. Second possibility is that a particular Old Testament law is explicitly overturned in the New Testament, which makes it clear to us that the law no longer applies under the New Covenant in Christ. So one example, it was the Sabbath law that I mentioned earlier. But you can also see the Old Testament food laws overturned in numerous New Testament passages, or the circumcision laws, or the Old Testament priesthood laws, or the Old Testament temple laws, or the Old Testament sacrificial laws, all overturned in the New Testament. And because they're explicitly overturned in the New Testament, we know they are no longer expected as a necessary expression of love for God and love for neighbour. Though, as reading through the New Testament shows, Christians are free to follow those laws if they want to, understanding that they've been fulfilled in Christ and that they should no longer be imposed on other Christians. But the third possibility is that the particular Old Testament law is just never mentioned in the New Testament.
So the real question is what to do in these last 2 situations. You might think that if the law is explicitly overturned, we can just ignore it. But that would be a mistake. Because the law, even though it's been repealed and even explicitly overturned, still has wisdom for us. There is wisdom in the Sabbath law. Not necessarily in the you should take a 1 day off in 7 pattern. No, the wisdom is at the deeper level of living a life that is characterized by dependence on God and refuses to bow to the idol of self-sufficiency. There's wisdom too in the circumcision and food laws, not in terms of personal hygiene, but in terms of provoking us to live a life that identifies us as God's people, and it's the faith, love and hope that we have in Jesus that should then mark us out as his new covenant people in Christ. Similarly, the commands that are never explicitly mentioned in the New Testament. We know we don't have to follow them since the law's been repealed, but they do still have wisdom for us. They show us what it meant for the Israelites under the Old Covenant to love God and love neighbour, and we're meant to use that to illuminate and inform what it might mean for us to love God and love neighbour in our own situation now in Christ under the new covenant.
Let's see what all of this might look like by looking at some of the other commands in Leviticus 19. If you look at verses 5 to 10, you can see that these two commands are grouped together. They're bounded by the marker, I am the Lord your God, at the end of verse 4 and again at the end of verse 10, and that phrase is used throughout the chapter to divide up the commands into different sections. So we're meant to take these two commands together. The first command in verses 5 to 8 is about fellowship offerings. These were voluntary offerings and were the only way you would get to eat meat in Old Testament Israel. If you wanted to celebrate God's goodness and feast with your family, you took an animal to the tabernacle. That's where it was killed. Its blood was poured out on the altar, and you and your family would eat the animal that day or the next. And that's the key point of this law. If there was anything left to the third day, you're not to eat it. It was to be burnt up. The second command in verses 9 to 10 is about harvesting crops. You're not to harvest to the very edges of your field. Don't try and get every last bit out of your crop, because the leftover bits are for the poor and alien. That is for those who don't have their own lands to harvest. Now, what do we make of these laws in the light of Jesus? Well, we know the entire sacrificial system reached its climax in the death of Jesus for the sins of the world, and so we know that the sacrificial laws are explicitly overturned. And there's nothing specific about harvesting crops and leaving the edges of there for the aliens that I'm aware of in the New Testament. So there's silence on this one too. But rather than disregard these laws, which is what we're often likely to do as Christians, how might they function for us today under the new covenant as wisdom for holy living in the light of Jesus?
Now, I hope you're a little bit intrigued by that question. How should we make use of these laws as a Christian? But I'm not going to answer it now. In fact, that's what we're going to talk about when we get together in Ethics this week. So maybe have a think about that and come ready to think about how we can apply the wisdom of these laws to living now in Christ for his glory. See you then.